Hello dear students, thank you so much for joining me here again on SJ's classes. We are into our fourth module, and as part of this module we discussed William Wordsworth, the great romantic poet, in the previous video lesson. We looked at some of his important contributions towards English literary criticism and especially his preface to lyrical ballads. In this video lesson we will have a short introduction to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and also we will look at Samuel Taylor Coleridge as a literary critic. You might have known him as one of the great poets of the Romantic era. You might have come across some of his poems, but in this video lesson we will be looking at him as a literary critic. Let us have a short introduction to his biography. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a leader of the British Romantic movement, was born on October 21, 1772 in Devonshire, England. After his father died in 1781, Coleridge attended Christ's Hospital School in London, where he met his lifelong friend Charles Lamb. En route to Wales in June 1794, Coleridge met a student named Robert Southey. Influenced by Plato's Republic, they constructed a vision of pantisocracy, which means a equal government for all and by all, a government in which people really have a role, not in just the process of election. So this was initiated by Robert Southey and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and it was influenced by Plato's Republic. I discussed Republic and Plato earlier as part of your first module, Classical Criticism. I'm sure you have an idea regarding what Republic is and what Plato stated in his work Republic. So it is from that particular work that they got the idea of this government by all, and they established this society which is governed by the idea of pantisocracy. So these two are two important influences in his life as well as literary career. There is yet another important influence. Let's see who that is. In 1795, Coleridge befriended William Wordsworth, who greatly influenced Coleridge's verses. In 1798, the two men, Wordsworth and Coleridge, collaborated on a joint volume of poetry entitled Lyrical Ballads. And as I said in the previous video, it is this publication that initiated Romantic movement, Romantic age in English literature. The collection titled Lyrical Ballads is considered the first great work of Romantic school of poetry and contains Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. In 1817, he published Biography Literaria, which contained his finest literary criticism, and that is the work we need to focus as part of your syllabus. As far as Wordsworth was concerned, we discussed his Preface to Lyrical Ballads, and with Coleridge we will be discussing his 1817 work Biographia Literaria, and contains his finest literary criticism. Coleridge died in London on July 25th, 1834. So that is all about his biography. Now let us look at him as a literary critic. Coleridge's critical career extended to 3 decades from 1800 to 1834. It can be categorized into 3 units. His Shakespearean criticism, that is what comes at first. His unique criticism of Wordsworth. I spoke about some of the criticism that he made in my previous video lesson, especially with Wordsworth's idea that poetry's language must be the same as that of prose language. This is something which Coleridge intensely argued against. And finally, the third phase in which his commentary on various poets came out. The only critical work that came out in his lifetime was Biographia Literaria. The process of poetic creation obsessed him all the time. Throughout his life, he was engaged in attempts to establish the principles of writing rather than to furnish rules on how to pass judgment on what has been written by others. So he was giving us more or less something like guidelines to the act of composition. He was not interested in setting up rules to judge other pieces of work. Moreover, rather he was giving us ideas, rules, guidelines to writing, especially writing poetry. He was so obsessed with poetry that he took no notice of novels. Novels did not was of no interest to Samuel Taylor Coleridge. For him, poetry was something which was essentially ideal and was composed with its immediate object, pleasure, and not truth. So Coleridge was obsessed with the idea of poetic composition. He has given us many guidelines as far as poetic composition is concerned. And when it comes to the motive of writing poetry, he says that the immediate object is pleasure, and not like what Socrates and Plato argued. It's not something to convey morality and truth. It's something written for pleasure. The immediate object of poetry is pleasure. And it also talks about the ideal. Perhaps he is quoting the Aristotelian dictum over there. And it is because of these contributions towards English literary criticism that George Sainsbury, the English critic, rates him along with Aristotle and Longinus. We have also I.A. Richards, who commented on Coleridge, stating that he is the founding father of all modern criticism. So we have some important statements being made there by literary critics. There are also charges of plagiarism leveled against him, that he was only echoing the sentiments of German philosophers. This is something which is very serious. It has been in existence for a long time, this argument that he was imitating, he was copying down the sentiments of German philosophers. And we can also find identifiable echoes from certain German philosophers like Schelling and Immanuel Kant. There are very clear and identifiable echoes from Schelling, especially in those sections in Biography where he develops his theory of metaphysics. And in his distinction between fancy and imagination, we also have to look at this particular idea, the difference between fancy and imagination. This forms the second part of your chapter on Coleridge. The fundamental epistemological ideas on which Coleridge's critical theory rests are clearly borrowed from Schelling. He also uses, without acknowledgement, Immanuel Kant's critique of judgment. Perhaps that is the reason why he called himself a high German transcendentalist. So perhaps Coleridge did all these knowingly, and that is why he called himself a high German transcendentalist. So please have the understanding that there was this controversy regarding his ideas. There was this charge against him that he had or he was only echoing the sentiments, the ideas that German philosophers actually put forth. The most notable idea explored by Coleridge in his Biographia Literaria is the distinction between fancy and imagination. Now that is what we are going to look at in the next part of this video. He treats imagination as the esemplastic power. You might be hearing this word for the first time, esemplastic power. It refers to the power that is capable of unifying or building into one. That is what esemplastic is all about. Unifying capability, the building into one capability that we have in us. And this is what he calls as imagination. So Coleridge treats imagination as the esemplastic power, or the power that is capable of unifying or building into one. The creative endowments, fancy, derived from the Greek word fantasia, and imagination from the Latin imaginatio, have received various meaning in different literary periods. In 18th century literary theory, imagination and fancy was regarded as a mode of memory. So it did not have the present meaning back in the 18th century. Hobbes defined imagination as nothing but decaying sense and concluded that imagination and fancy are but one thing. So in the 18th century, literary world looked at these two words as, or having they regarded both these words as the same. They thought that these two words had the same meaning. During Renaissance period, fancy was meant the lesser type of imagination. Surprisingly, the 18th century neoclassical writers accorded fancy the role or reference to a more creative mental power. Wordsworth, in his preface to Poems of 1815, offers an illuminating idea on the functions of fancy and imagination, detailing the former as a capricious, which means something which is changeable, something which is subject to change, as a capricious and evanescent. Evanescent means which can vanish just like vapor. So Wordsworth says that fancy is something that is evanescent and capricious at the same time, which means that which can change from time to time. Now, so the basic idea is that both these words had different meanings as far as English literary criticism is concerned. At different points of time, people attributed different meanings to these two words, but they all regarded these two words to be similar to an extent, fancy and imaginations. Especially in the 18th century, they continued under the impression that both these words had the same meaning. In opposition to these theories, Coleridge developed his theory of imagination. In chapter 4 of Biography Literaria, Coleridge tells that fancy and imagination are not two names with one meaning, or the lower and higher degree of the one and the same power, but are two distinct and widely different faculties. In chapter 13 of Biographia, Coleridge introduces the distinction between two kinds of imagination. So right now we are going to discuss the two kinds of imagination. We are not going to distinguish between imagination and fancy, but we are trying to understand, as Coleridge said, the two types of imaginations, which are primary and secondary. Primary imagination is the faculty by which we perceive the world around us. It is merely the power of receiving impressions of the external through our senses. So as far as primary imagination is concerned, it is that faculty in us which enables us to perceive the world around us. Now he is not talking about the sight. He is talking about that particular capability of us which helps us to put in order, put to logic all that we see around us. As he says, it is merely the power of receiving impressions of the external through our senses. The primary imagination perceives objects both in their parts and as a whole. It is an involuntary act of the mind. Just like you spend a day, and at the end of the day you will have lot of memories, and you will have many sights which you can recall. Now all this has been arranged by the primary imagination. The human mind receives impressions and sensation from the outside world. Unconsciously and involuntarily, it imposes some sort of order on those impressions, reduces them to size and shape so that the mind is able to form a clear image of the outside world. It is in this way that clear and coherent perception becomes possible. So primary imagination helps us in perceiving things, in giving us a certain order, a certain logic to the things that we see around us. Let us look at what secondary imagination is. Secondary imagination is universal and possessed by all. The secondary imagination makes artistic creation possible. Now this is that faculty in us or in poets that make creation, artistic creation, possible. It requires a conscious effort. It works upon what is perceived by the primary imagination. So what secondary imagination does is, it takes out images from primary imagination and it treats it as the raw materials, and what it does is it reshapes and remodels it. And it reshapes and remodels it into objects of beauty. And that is, as far as Coleridge is concerned, artistic creation. It is assemblastic, and it dissolves, diffuses and dissipates in order to create. Look at the three words used by Coleridge. It's plastic. As I said earlier, it's that capability of the mind or imagination which helps us to club everything that we see around us. And it dissolves, diffuses. Diffuse means to spread, and dissipates. Dissipate means to move away from each other. So it dissolves, diffuses and dissipates the raw materials that it gets from primary imagination. And what does it do afterwards? It engages in the activity called creation, artistic creation. The secondary imagination is at the root of all poetic activity. It is the power which reveals itself in the balance or reconciliation of opposite and discordant qualities, and Coleridge calls it as a magical synthetic power. It fuses the various faculties of the soul, subjective with objective, the human mind with external nature, the spiritual with physical or material. So look at the various blending that happens as part of, or because we have, or because someone possesses secondary imagination. It fuses the various ideas. It fuses the soul with the subject, the subjective idea with the objective idea, the human mind with the external nature, the spiritual with the physical or material. So all these happens because you have secondary imagination, your faculty of secondary imagination. The primary and secondary imagination does not differ from each other in kind. Please don't be under the impression that these two are two separate faculties that we have. It's only in the degree that it differs. The difference between primary and secondary imagination is only of degree. The secondary imagination is more active, more conscious and more voluntary than the primary one. I hope you have an idea regarding what is primary imagination and what is secondary imagination. Primary imagination helps us in perceiving things around us through our senses, obviously. What secondary imagination does is that it mixes all these raw materials that you have gained through your senses into something artistic, and that is what Coleridge calls as the artistic creation. Now let us look at what fancy is and what are the differences between imagination and fancy. Imagination and fancy differ in kind and nature, whereas imagination is creative. Fancy, which is common possession of man, is not creative. It is a mechanical process which receives the elementary images which come to it ready-made, and without altering these, fancy reassembles them into a different order from that in which it was received. So imagination helps you in converting the raw materials into something different by applying your subjective, objective ideas, by applying your soul, your own concepts, your own philosophy and ideologies into it. Fancy just arranges everything that you get. Fancy reassembles all that you acquire through your senses into a different order from that in which it was received. It only combines what it perceives into beautiful shapes, but does not fuse or unify. So this is where the difference comes. Imagination is able to fuse and unify. As I said earlier, it dissolves, dissipates and diffuses the raw materials received from primary imagination. But fancy, what it does is it does not, or rather it does not unify or bring together all these elements that you have perceived as part from your senses. Fancy is a kind of memory that arbitrarily brings together images, and even when brought together, these images continue to retain their separate and individual properties. They receive no coloring or modification from the mind. For example, you watch a movie, you get so many ideas from it, and you just leave it. You have a logical sequence as far as the ideas are concerned because you got it from a particular film. But when you apply those ideas to the ideas that you have in your life, and you write something else, you create something else, that becomes imagination. Fancy just arranges whatever that you have in your mind. It does not engage itself in the process called artistic creation. Fancy is not at all a creative power. It only combines what it perceives into beautiful shapes. Now the process can be explained with the help of the difference between a mechanical mixture and a chemical mixture. In a mechanical mixture, a number of ingredients are brought together. They are mixed up, but they do not lose their individual properties. But this is not the case with chemical mixture. In a chemical mixture compound, the different ingredients combine to form something new. The different ingredients no longer exist as separate identities. They lose their respective properties and fuse together to create something new and entirely different. A compound is an act of creation, while a mixture is merely a bringing together of a number of separate elements. So the chemical mixture can be compared with imagination, and the mechanical mixture can be compared with fancy. So these are all the ideas that I have to share regarding Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I gave you a short introduction to his biography. I spoke about some of his important works like Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Lyrical Ballads, and Biographia Literaria. It is the text Biographia Literaria that we had to focus as part of your syllabus. And the most important thing, perhaps an often repeated question in your previous year question papers, is the distinction between fancy and imagination. I hope now you have a clear idea regarding the differences between fancy and imagination. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video lesson.